Well, good morning. I'm Anna Palmer, co-author of the Politico Playbook. I'm joined by my colleague and Playbook co-author Jake Sherman to host a virtual Playbook interview with Brooke Rollins, director of the White House Domestic Policy Council, to talk about the White House's strategy for the next coronavirus bailout package, her approach to her new role, and what the White House policy initiatives she thinks could gain momentum before the end of the year.
Today's briefing is kicking off a new playbook series, Inside the Recovery, which will bring viewers behind the scenes as we talk to top leaders in Congress, the White House, business executives, and political operatives about how they're navigating this new world order and putting forth ideas to help America correct course ahead of the 2020 presidential election. Just a reminder, if you have questions for Brooke, you could tweet Politico Live with the hashtag AskPolitico, and we'll get to some audience questions before we wrap up the conversation.
Well, Brooke, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We want to get started. We've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. It was obviously a tense weekend across the country with protests, which at times were violent, breaking out in more than 30 cities, including right outside the White House gates. Democrats are calling for a number of different policies to be enacted, including making chokeholds illegal, establishing a commission to study the status of Black men and boys, and condemning police brutality that they want all enacted. I just want to get from your vantage point, you do policy, you have a very big portfolio. Can you give us a sense of where the White House is, if there's any legislative activity that you all want to see or executive orders, or kind of how you're framing this from the policy perspective?
Well, good morning, Anna and Jake, and to all of your wonderful listeners and I guess watchers out in America. Thank you for having me, first of all. Second of all, it was a really difficult weekend. I think for the 99% of Americans who, while we may agree to disagree, love this country and know that what happened to George Floyd was unacceptable and tragic and horrible and should never happen to any man or woman or son or daughter or father or mother ever again. To witness the destruction and the violence and the mayhem this weekend. I was up here at the White House yesterday, Sunday afternoon, and there were thousands of protesters, most of whom were peaceful. But there were those, as we saw what turned into last night, just a couple hundred feet away from the White House, fire, St. Paul's Church on fire, 300 years old, where I think every president since the early 1800s has attended churches. It's really devastating. But to your question, and what I will say is this president and his focus on bringing safety and security and prosperity to America has never been more laser focused. And so what does that look like in the coming days? We are working through right now. I don't want to get ahead of my boss ever, but we are working through a list of solutions and possibilities, bipartisan. How do we come together? How do we use this as a unifying force for this country? It was interesting just this morning, probably with many of you, I saw a Democrat elected official, I believe from the state house in Georgia, being interviewed, African American, and he actually thanked the president for his leadership and for, helping with such difficult times and helping the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta. And I thought, this is what we need. We need everyone to rise above the division and the divide and come together. And we can come out of this, I'm sure we will, stronger and better than where we were, even just 2 months ago, but certainly where we are today.
I think that's probably a minority of the voice. I think a lot of people are wondering, when is the president going to speak? He's definitely been active on Twitter. He spoke at the NASA space mission, shuttle launch over the weekend, but there hasn't been a big address. Do you expect that? Do you think the country needs it? Does the president need to have a direct conversation with the Black community right now?
The president from day one, from our perspective, has been engaging with the American people. He is a very unique president in how he does that. He sort of changed the game a little bit. His comments on Saturday in Florida that I, of course, helped review and edit and write, and then he gave them, and his continuing narrative to the American people, talking to the press by moving some of his team, like myself, out to talk to the American people. So to be determined, but what I would say is everything's on the table. And I think ultimately he believes, and rightfully so, that he is in a constant narrative and conversation with his citizens, those that voted for him and those that didn't, and those that believe in his policies and those that may not. But all of us believe in an America where everyone can succeed, where no matter what the color of your skin or what your gender or what your last name is, that everyone has a shot at the American dream. And it's interesting, Anna, because just 2.5 months ago, the unprecedented prosperity that this country was experiencing. Now, there were still many left behind. There were still crumbling inner cities. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. There was still a lot of work to do, but have the lowest unemployment rate and the lowest poverty rate for African-American communities, our Hispanic communities, our veteran communities, our Americans with just a high school diploma that didn't have a college. All of it was unprecedented. And so to understand what is possible, because in 3.5 years, what we've seen, many said was impossible. And then to look into the future and understand what that looks like to get all of that back is really a priority. So safety and security, unity, and then figuring out how to get America back to work and bring our prosperity back. And even greater is as of that most priority.
I want to move on to some of the policies that you think will bring that back. We have one more question on the protest. Tucker Carlson took to Fox News the other night and blamed you personally for saying for the president shouldn't say anything about the protests in Minneapolis because it would seem racist. Is that an accurate representation of your comments?
Jake, thank you for bringing this up. I was watching Tucker on Friday back in Texas, where my family is, and watching because we love Tucker. And literally out of the blue, I'm named for creating or pursuing a conversation in the White House where he said that I said we shouldn't talk about the riots because it maybe seem as racist. I can't tell you how far from the truth that is. I'm not sure where he got his information. I was not called ahead of time to ask. But what I will say is Friday morning, the call he was referencing, we were having a discussion because we have an amazing agenda for our distressed and vulnerable communities and what we want to do, what this president is going to do to not only bring all of America rushing back, but most importantly, those with the least among us, what we can do, which is where the unemployment is being hit the hardest, where the destruction and such, sadness, job loss, et cetera, is continuing. And so the discussion actually was about whether we move the announcement of that agenda a week so we can focus on the riots and we can focus on what's happening in America. Again, I don't know where that disconnect came. I adore Tucker. I think he does such a good job. And especially for those of us that believe in conservative free market, limited government, cutting taxes, school choice, all the things I fought for my entire career, first in Texas and now here. But thank you for allowing me to talk about that, because no, there has never been a deep or really any conversation that I know of where anyone has said we should not talk about the riots because it's racist. If anything, what these riots have allowed us to do is bring together the peaceful protesters, not just the African-American, but the Hispanic and Caucasian and people of every color, to talk about what's wrong in this country and how we can bring justice to everyone, not just the George Floyds and the Ahmaud Arbery's and the Breonna Taylors and just the devastating, tragic events that have happened in this country, but for all Americans that are being treated unjustly. Let's have that conversation. And there's no one better to lead it than this president from our perspective. So we're really looking forward to moving forward, and never for a moment have we not wanted to discuss what was happening in America. It is of utmost importance.
Now, let me ask about, so we're going to start now in the next couple of weeks negotiating over Congress and the White House, and we're going to be covering, obviously, the negotiations over a next coronavirus package, which it seems like Mitch McConnell believes should happen. Nancy Pelosi believes it should happen. They obviously have different views about what that might look like. I wonder if you could give us a couple of things. I'm not asking you to draw any red lines, but a couple of things that the White House is particularly motivated to get in a package, in a next package, which we expect and Congress seems to expect will happen before the 4th of July recess. Your thoughts on the content and the timeline.
Well, thank you for that. I think it is important to, before we look ahead, to look back and, the CARES Act, which distributed $660 unprecedented billion to business owners across America in forgivable loans. You know, my mom is a small business owner in Glen Rose, Texas, where I grew up. She runs a bed and breakfast. And it is those sorts of small businesses that are the backbone of this country, and what this president can do to, and what we can do, frankly, Congress, to make sure that the small businesses, that the single moms who raised 3 daughters in Glen Rose, Texas, and who supported them in, you know, in that way, that they can continue providing that backbone for the country. So $660 billion there, that $2,400 in direct checks to Americans, the $2 billion to community health centers, which mainly serve distressed and vulnerable communities. I mean, clearly, we're not here to talk about the comorbidity or the extreme harm and the hit of the most vulnerable communities with the COVID-19, but that has to be a priority. I mean, our efforts to lift those communities up continues, but now realizing the health disparities is a big piece of that. The $200 million on telehealth, again, for the communities that don't have access to a doctor like so many of us do, just a few minutes away. What can we do to get good health care to them, but combine that with getting those Americans back to work? So looking at what has already been done is important, but looking ahead, again, not to get ahead of the president, but he's talked about things like more tax cuts, payroll tax cuts, restaurant deductibility, so that the restaurant industry, which I think employs 11 million people, maybe more in this country, can really get back to work. Obviously talked about liability protections and other things. There is a lot on the table, and this president is taking phone calls daily, as are we all, from both Republicans and Democrats, on what we need to do to make sure that this country is reopening safely, but that we're not destroying not just lives, but livelihoods in the balance, frankly.
You mentioned the payroll tax cut, which the president has been pretty vocal about his support for. Very little support on Capitol Hill among Republicans and Democrats for that right now. What do you think is going to be kind of the 1 or 2 biggest sticking points that you're seeing right now for this latest package?
You know, I'm not sure if I know the exact sticking points. What I will say, and this is the 2 years I've worked alongside this president and for this president, I was part of his economic advisory team when he was candidate, Donald J. Trump, as a volunteer, of course. I was running a think tank in Texas at the time. I have seen firsthand now for years, this president is a change maker. And what many believed would never happen, whether it was criminal justice reform or the permanent funding of HBCUs, our historically Black colleges, or whether it's the most, or maybe the most, maybe at least some of the most important tax cuts, providing relief to America that we've ever seen. You know, almost all of those people said were impossible, and he proved otherwise. Interestingly, a lot of those that I just mentioned were bipartisan. Some of them were not. But we believe, and this is the reason I'm here, and this is the reason I was so proud to accept the Domestic Policy Council role. I believe that this president is so focused on what's best for America and not as focused on what the media is saying, what the polls are saying, what the establishment is saying, what the left is saying. It really is about what he believes is the right thing for America. So even if, you know, he thinks the payroll tax and our team thinks the payroll tax is of utmost priority, and even if we're not getting as much feedback from the Hill, which I'm not sure that's true, I just don't know. I believe so strongly in this president's ability to move the ball and to get it close to the finish line and then get it into the goal. And so we're just going to swing for the fences like we always do and do what we believe is best for the American people, how we can get the most people back to work and to a real shot at the American dream.
It's a 2-part question on infrastructure. I mean, there's been mixed messages, to say the least, from Republicans on whether infrastructure is a priority or feasible. I mean, what's the White House's view on that?
You know, there have been a lot of discussions. Obviously, the president from day one has talked about our crumbling infrastructure in this country, and that ultimately we have to invest, again, especially in our most vulnerable communities. This isn't just inner cities, this is rural America too. What can we do in our short period of time while we're here to bring the best of policy and policy making and lift the most people to a real shot at prosperity and dignity and safety and security? And so I believe this president infrastructure is at the top of that list. So to be determined whether it remains in the mix moving forward, I mean, frankly, nobody knows, but I think this president, it's a priority for him.
And so you've been involved in conservative policy circles for a long time, and two things are striking to me. Number one, Anna and I started covering Congress in 2010 when Congress wouldn't spend any money without cutting corresponding discretionary spending. So it's a sea change from where we were 10 years ago. I'm just curious. I mean, programs like the PPP, which is just cutting direct checks to businesses, unthinkable 10 years ago for conservatives. Infrastructure is a massive expenditure. I mean, where do you fall on the, Congress is just spending unseemly and ungodly amounts of money. And how does the president wrangle that under control? I mean, are we looking at some sort of belt tightening in the near future, or we're not looking at that in the near future?
I think the great thing about this president is he is not in the typical Republican box.
Right.
To your point. Clearly, the pandemic and COVID-19 is again, I keep using the word unprecedented, but it is an unprecedented time in our country. And to your point, Jake, you're right. I have spent almost 20 years fighting for fiscal restraint and cutting taxes. And frankly, I've always done that because I believe that helps the least among us the most. That's how you create an economy that roars, that brings everyone along with them. And so ultimately, the long-term health of the country is at the top of the president's mind, and he talks about it a lot. But we won't even have an America or a country in which my children, my Jake, Anna, Luke, and Lily, my future grandchildren, your future grandchildren, will even have a shot at the sort of life we have right now unless we take drastic action. And again, this president does not fit in a typical box. He will do what he believes is right for this country, no matter who calls and says it's the wrong thing to do for whatever reason. And so I feel so, I trust his instinct so much and what he believes in and what he's trying to do for America. I remember when he announced and he came down the escalator and there were 17 Republicans, and I had never met Donald Trump. I had worked with Rick Perry and worked with Ted Cruz and worked with Scott Walker and worked with Jeb Bush, as these great governors and Marco Rubio and others, and all wonderful. But I'll never forget, I don't know if it was at that moment, but when the president started talking about as a candidate, then again, 17 people in the race at that point, that he wanted to drain the swamp. He wanted to return power to the people. This was a man that has never even run for political office before. And then you would see thousands of people coming to hear him speak. This is a politician. And now, having been on his team for a couple of years and attended the rallies with him, and I love to walk through the audience because you'll go from a lawyer to a plumber to a single mom. I mean, the convening ability of his vision of returning power to the people is truly, truly remarkable. And so, Jake, to your point, it is an unusual time with an unexpected, but a president that will never give up and that is relentless and tireless and convicted as he fights for the American people.
We are quickly running out of time, but we have a couple other things we do want to hit on. You have, besides coronavirus, obviously top of mind right now, but you have a very broad, kind of portfolio, to say the least. You've been involved in, before this position, in criminal justice reform. Give us a sense, besides the coronavirus package, like what are the three things that the administration thinks it needs policy-wise from Congress this summer?
I clearly healthcare and ensuring that all Americans have access to quality healthcare at a cost they can afford is very, very top of the line. Bringing opportunities to distressed communities continues to be, I think, such an important priority for this administration and for this president. It's interesting. Before COVID hit, we had just begun a series of events around the country that the president was going to highlight, the vice president was going to be a part of, that many of our cabinet members and administration were going to be part of. It's called Opportunity Now. And we started in Charlotte. We were going to move around the country. And the idea is bringing not 10,000 or 15,000, but 1,500 to 2,000 community leaders Democrat and Republican, together to talk about how we can bring jobs and prosperity to all Americans, but especially into these vulnerable communities, again, before pre-COVID, and now getting back to that focus. And with great leaders like Dr. Ben Carson and Senator Tim Scott and others from these communities who are focused on these communities alongside us, I think we can get there. So I would say healthcare, jobs in the economy, and then really, if I had to choose a third, I think that the regulatory reform piece of this, I think the president himself has said that while the tax cuts were important, the regulatory reform was at least as important. And again, that goes back to returning power to the people, moving government out of the way. And a lot of people think of regulatory reform as well. We've, the Clean Power Plan or NEPA or, all these sort of terms that you guys know, but most of America does not. But what I like to remind everyone is that regulatory reform goes to the very heart of the single mother who lives in Detroit, who wants to open a hair salon, but cannot because the state requires her to have 1,500 hours or whatever it is in training, which in some states is more than becoming a pilot. So regulatory reform has a big brand. And again, I think people in Washington consider it specific to our agencies and what we're rolling back in rules. But truly, it is reshaping and transforming America back to the place where the single mom in Detroit really does have a shot at the American dream and opening up her own business and things like school choice, getting her children into schools that serve those children and give them a shot rather than being trapped because of their zip code or she can't write a big check for a private school. So all of this weaves together. And again, in the most unexpected way, I believe this president will go down. And one of his legacies will be, go down in history, and one of his legacies will be having done more for those with the least among us than most any president before him.
I'm curious what you think. This is the last question. It's an audience question, and that we're going to have to wrap on this because we're already over time. But if in a second term, what is Donald Trump's second term about? What is he asking the American people to, for the permission essentially to do in a second 4 years?
The way I would sum it up, and I know we're out of time because I am a policy person, I would love to go through every single policy, but what I would say is this, that this president's vision and the success of this White House to date, but more importantly in a second term, really is about that every American, no matter what race, no matter what background, no matter what gender, no matter what religion, no matter where they come from, a small town in Texas, from Connecticut, wherever it may be, that they have the peace and prosperity and dignity and the real shot at building a life for themselves and their family and a job that they are proud of and that can support their life. And so ultimately, that really wraps together everything, I think, at least in the Domestic Policy Council that we're working on, from healthcare to education reform, to jobs and prosperity, to, as we talked about, occupational licensing, to higher education reform. All of the above truly is about what's best for the Americans out in this country who just want a shot at the American dream.
Brooke, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it, and going a little bit over time this morning. We know you're busy, but come back and join us in a few weeks, hopefully, as things heat up on the coronavirus package front. But have a great rest of your week. And before we finish up today, Jake and I wanted to run through the top couple of things that we're following at the start of this week.
Anna, Jake, thank y'all so much.
Appreciate it, Brooke.
Thank you, guys.
So Jake, why don't you tee it up? What's the first thing kind of on top of mind this week for you?
Yeah, I was interested to hear a few things from Brooke, frankly, about the infrastructure package. She's was a bit not skeptical, but non-committal on whether the president will pursue an infrastructure package. She did say the president is looking at several different elements of legislation regarding the unrest in the country, and didn't say what, was non-committal about whether the president will address the nation. I think the one thing that's number one, Anna, on our list is, will Trump speak? Will he say something to the country? Something that we kind of hit on in Playbook this morning, which I think is worth repeating, and maybe I'll get heat for saying this, but it's not that he said nothing. He said things about the unrest in America. It's not what some people want to hear, but he believes, quite frankly, that the focus of the American people should be, at least in part, on some of these violent riots and protests, and some of them are riots. Buildings are getting burnt down just, a couple minutes from me and you here in Washington. Popular, storefronts, banks, supermarkets, and he thinks people's focus should be on that there is an out of control element of this country that's using this this incident, this unrest in the country to destroy stuff. That's what he believes. I'm not saying that's right, wrong, or indifferent, but he has spoken, and I could tell you in the White House, they believe that no one's going to be happy if he speaks publicly and gives a national address. If you don't like him, you're not going to like what he has to say. If you do like him, you're going to like what he has to say. And that's what they feel. So if, in my estimation, I really don't know whether he'll give an address. I can't predict that, but I think that's the feeling inside the White House right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the other interesting thing that really dovetails to our second kind of thing that we are watching closely, which is really all about this next COVID bill, where the negotiations are. She didn't have any bright lines. I think, they clearly don't want to be boxed in at this point in the kind of, month or so of negotiations that are happening, but seemed optimistic about kind of the packages that they have already crafted. And so kind of for me, I think one of the things that you and I have been talking a lot about is in the Senate, in the House, the House's hearings, if this is going to get done before this July 4th recess, or, because of, things that are going on in this country, or because Republicans and Democrats can't come together on this, is it going to get punted into August, into July? That's something I think that timeline is really still pretty uncertain.
Yeah, and listen, the president has been skeptical about the need for increased unemployment insurance, a plus up on the current unemployment insurance. Democrats are not going to relent on that. I mean, they want to go even further than that. So right now, the two sides aren't even in the batter's box and on the pitcher's mound, so to speak. They're still really not even at square one. There's basically no overlap on policy at this point. And there's a long way to go until there's another package. And I think people have begun to expect something by the 4th of July recess. And if they don't get it by then, I think that's going to be, maybe markets react to that, maybe not. I've stopped predicting the stock market, but certainly the political market, the market in which we exist, believes something needs to get done in the July 4th neighborhood. Now, the one thing I would say, and we noted this in Playbook last week, is the House is going to come back into session after July 4th for a while. They're going to be in DC for a couple weeks, potentially 3 weeks. And that will make maybe some of the attention go to July and use August, the August recess, the campaign season recess, as a backstop for these negotiations. But again, you're going to hear a lot of noise in the next couple weeks, but this is really going to come down to Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, Kevin McCarthy and Chuck Schumer. And one thing I would say is I would expect Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, to take a larger role in negotiating this package, either in tandem with Steven Mnuchin or in place of Steven Mnuchin, because I think Meadows is itching to get back into the negotiations, and I think Republicans would be happy to see Meadows as part of the negotiations.
Absolutely. Well, lots to watch. Unfortunately, we are quickly running out of time, but we want to thank you for joining us this morning. And just a reminder, with all this infrastructure talk, our conversation in this series of Inside the Recovery with Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, 11 a.m. on Wednesday, could not come at a better time. Clearly, we will have to see if she is on the same page about whether or not the infrastructure actually has a shot before the end of the year.
If you enjoyed this briefing and don't already get Playbook, which should be relatively few of you, we invite you to subscribe to Playbook. All you have to do is text PB to 66866. Stay safe and have a great week.